Okay, let's get started. I'm sure people will trickle in as it goes along. Hello, thank you all for coming. This is the fracking discussion panel. We are going to discuss the benefits and detriments of fracking, which is hydraulic fracturing, a process to get natural gas out of the ground. We have a diverse panel. We have Dr. Andrews, Dr. Lutz, and Dr. Delshad, all of different departments: economics, political science, and geology. I am Christian Novia, president of the Political Science Club, and if I could make a plug before we start, we meet on Wednesdays, every other Wednesday, because today's a Wednesday, in Ruby Jones 104 at 7:30. So feel free to stop by. We have plenty of events and open discussion for any political viewpoint. So first, I want to start off by having each panelist introduce themselves, and I guess we'll start right from left.
Start with me?
Yep.
I'm Tom Andrews. I'm in the Department of Economics. I teach mostly microeconomics stuff. I have an interest in environmental economics, but I'm not a particular expert in the economics of fracking, so to speak. But I do read the news, and I have followed the situation, so I'd like to enter the discussion.
I'm Ashley Delshad, professor in the Political Science Department. My areas of interest are in domestic policy broadly, but I do focus on environmental and energy issues. Haven't done a whole lot of research myself, academic research on fracking, though of course do follow the news. I'm very interested in both the pluses and the minuses of fracking.
And I'm Tim Lutz from the Department of Geology and Astronomy. I mostly teach courses that are related to the environment one way or the other. My sort of favorite course and the course that sort of gets me going the most is called Humans and the Environment. And it's a 100-level interdisciplinary course that many people take for general education credit. And it's the course that lets me think most broadly about the issues that are affecting us today. And water and energy are two topics from sort of the geological environment that I try to bring in and build on the most, and of course both of those are critical to a discussion of fracking, so I'm looking forward to hearing what other people have to say about this as well. I have not done any particular detailed research on fracking, but through my interests in energy, I learned quite a bit about natural gas and its relation to other energy sources, and I'll share that with you if the chance comes up.
Okay. So how this will all work out is, first I'll pose a beginning question. After the panelists answer, they can debate each other's answers, hence the fight over fracking. If anybody has a dissenting opinion, as long as it doesn't get too out of hand, I won't interfere and knock my hand on the table if it's getting a little too anxious like it has in past events. But other than that, they are free to speak, to argue with one another, and I will eventually include the audience. And if you have any questions for the panelists at a time, we will open it up for discussion, and each panelist can bounce it off one another, bounce it off the audience. So I'd first like to start with the most general question there is for Dr. Lutz. What is fracking?
Okay, fracking pertains to one particular aspect of the technologies that have been developed to exploit what are generally called tight gas sources. Natural gas, in most of the history of its use in the United States, has been a gas that's been associated with oil for the most part. So when you drill for oil, you almost inevitably hit some gas. That gas is what's called free-flowing gas. Like you may have seen film footage of people striking oil and seeing that sort of geyser of oil come out of the well. That oil is pushed up partly by the compressed gas that's also in the well. In those situations, gas just wants to get out of the ground. And in fact, if it hadn't been for the fact that petroleum has always fetched a much higher price than gas, we probably would have been using gas much more throughout our American history. As a young geologist, when I went into areas in which oil was being exploited, the gas was simply flared off. It was so inexpensive and so relatively unusable that they burned it instead of trying to ship it somewhere for use. Now things have changed. Now our gas production from those free-flowing wells has been declining. The peak until this year was in 1973 for gas production in the United States. Since that point in time, we've tried to explore more and more different types of sources, and the most recent one, which is where fracking comes in, is what are called tight gas deposits. And these are deposits which, when you drill into them, the gas does not want to come out. What you need to do is to essentially fracture the rock so that the gas that's in the rock has pathways to get to your well and out of the ground. So when you hear about fracking, it's referring to the rock fracturing that occurs in that type of extraction situation. The fracking process is one that involves pumping high pressure water into the rock. The water is mixed with chemicals and with small bits of material like you'd call it sand if you saw it. And that mixture is pushed down into the rock. When the rock fractures, the chemicals allow the water to penetrate quickly along the fractured surfaces. The sand particles help prop the fractures open. So the fracking process is one whereby you create fractures, you prop the fractures open, and then the gas flows out. A single well may need to be fracked multiple times in order to keep the gas flowing, and I think we'll probably get a chance to discuss some of these issues later. But basically that is fracking. It's a technology which has allowed us to exploit gas resources which up until very recently were not used. They weren't even on the horizon of a lot of people when they thought about what a gas resource was.
Okay. I'm sure none of the panelists have any dissension.
Oh, I don't know.
So I'm going to pose another very general question. As we know, fracking, hydraulic fracturing does happen in Pennsylvania. We do harvest natural gas. But in New York, at least for a while, they've had a moratorium on it, and it's sketchy in Ohio and other areas. I wanted to ask the panel, and feel free, whoever answers first, and, or to pass along. Should there be a moratorium or some sort of ban or limitation to fracking in Pennsylvania?
You know, I think I can speak to it from a policy perspective to some extent and a bit dance around that question perhaps, and say that, you know, at the federal level there have been fairly few policies enacted with regards to fracking. In recent years, I think right about a year ago now, Congress did order, if you will, the EPA to begin studying this phenomena with some initial results to be released by the end of the year and a final report in 2014 where we can actually have perhaps some more solid data about the impacts of fracking. I think it's probably not unreasonable to say that being a bit cautious about undertaking activities prior to knowing their consequences could be a bad thing, when it being so-called kind of precautionary in our stance. But at this point, even the states that you said, you know, there are some states that have moratoriums, it seems like, if anything, the more common policy response has been to encourage disclosure, if you will. So make it such that the public has more information about fracking, especially as it's occurring near them. And I think that when we look at your question, should there be a moratorium, I partly, I guess, am here as an environmentalist representative, but as a practical person, you have to also consider that while it sounds great to be precautionary, right, great to wait till we actually have some more information about the environmental and human health consequences of fracking, which we might talk more about. There's also the issue of the fact that we are not doing so well economically right now, and people really like the prospect of something that is going to create jobs in their community. It's kind of hard to completely dismiss those concerns when people really are struggling to pay their mortgages and provide food for their families, and this offers the opportunity to create jobs, not to mention, of course, our omnipresent concerns dating back to the 70s, but certainly reignited after 9/11 about energy independence, right? Or at least perhaps greater security, diversifying our sources and where we're getting the energy from, And I think undoubtedly, like, whatever environmental costs it may hold or may not hold, there are certainly things to be said about moving ahead to allow for job creation and to allow for a greater diversification of our energy portfolio.
This is exactly the type of short-term thinking that gets us into trouble today, economically and environmentally, Ashley. Just to follow up on, this tremendous debate we're supposed to be having here. One of the things that, of course, we think about is the jobs issue. It's the economic stupid type of thinking, and this guides a lot of our decision making. It has to. Yet, at the same time, it's worth remembering that we can't just think about the present day. And one of the things that happens when we get into the type of exploitation that's involved with fracking is that we permanently alter the future, and not in ways that we necessarily will be happy with 10, 20, or 50 years from now, which is at least as long as the Marcellus shale in Pennsylvania would be a producing unit. So I think there always has to be this balance in policy between the things that we would like to have now and the realization that we, and certainly our children, and for us faculty, our students, are going to be living with the decisions we make now well into the future. And some of them will certainly turn out to look pretty good, I'm guessing, but some of them will almost inevitably turn out to look really bad. And so I think it's a tough balancing act to decide on policies that appropriately weigh present needs with concerns for future as well. It's the whole essence of sustainability. How do we balance out those types of valuations?
Well, I'll just respond briefly and say that from an environmentalist perspective, I completely agree that the notion of being precautionary is clearly the direction to go. My hesitation is more looking at it from a broader picture, and certainly from the political lens and at what's going to be kind of politically palatable and actually feasible, right? Nationwide moratorium, I'm not sure, is something that is politically palatable or feasible at this point, given, among other things, our economic situation.
Well, it certainly would be double talk in a way for the U.S. government. Over the last 10 to 15 years, the United States government has put hundreds of millions of dollars into developing fracking technologies. This is not something that was taken up by the gas and oil companies who were spending their money on other things, probably some very nice things that they wanted to get. But the government, in fact, did put a lot of money into the technology of fracking. And so now at this point, we put all of that money in. Now are we going to say, well, oh, hold on, not so sure that was a good idea. It's a, how do we decide?
I'd just like to weigh in on one thing, and that is, well, 2 points actually. Tim, you said by fracking we're changing the future, but by not fracking we're also changing the future. So either way, the future is altered. So just to be clear, I think what we're talking about here is, destroying water supplies. Is that the main, at least in part, irrevocably? That one of my main concerns is that the stuff gets in the groundwater, and you just can't undo that. That's done. And I think in New York that's a huge problem, or a huge issue, because they get a lot of their drinking water from the groundwater. Not that we don't, but we don't have New York City. But the other issue is the job creation, and you hear that argument all the time, that the jobs are being created, and the problem I have with that argument is it counts the jobs on the positive side. When any economist, if you said the economist stupid, which to me that sounds like the stupid economics, right? The more work something is to accomplish, the less net benefit you get. So ideally what we would like is the gas just flowing out of the ground with no work whatsoever, right? That would be the golden goose. The fact that you have to put a lot of people to work to get something done is not positive, that's a negative. With the exception of the fact that we're in an unemployed economy, so that means we do need to find ways to create jobs. But just the mere fact that this will create jobs is not not necessarily a reason to do it whatsoever. There are lots of ways to create jobs.
And
it's
Pennsylvania
just-
has discovered hiring prison guards, for example.
Well,
as
sure,
one
I
way
mean, that's a
to
great way to
jobs.
put people back to
Yeah.
work, right? So, I mean, build lots of prisons and you get work, putting people in construction, and you get work, people keeping people locked up. I mean, those are just jobs, right? So if that's the way you're gonna count it, then, that's what matters. But to me, the job goes on the negative side, not on the positive side. You wanna look at the value of what's coming out of the ground versus the cost of, getting it out of the ground. And then the other issue is just the carbon issue and the global warming issue. I just think that a lot of our economic policy and our environmental policy, well, the economic policy, I know for a fact, is based on an environment, a world that's virtually limitless. I mean, most of the economic thinking that's been developed over the years has been predicated on a virtually empty system. So, it doesn't matter if I piss in my backyard. Oops, that's usually but if nobody lives even close to me, it's not an issue. But as the world gets fuller and fuller and fuller, we start to bump up against these limits. And I think that is going to be the defining issue of the next century, or how we deal with these hard constraints. And the carbon one is a big deal. And I was reading recently that we can safely put another, I think it's 500 and some gigatons in the atmosphere, maybe. But if you look at the proven reserves of what the oil and gas companies are already planning to put up there, it's like 4 or 5 times that. So they've already banked on destroying the environment. And so there's lots of ways to take carbon out of the atmosphere, but the surest way is not let it get in there in the first place. So from that perspective, a moratorium might be a good idea, but you gotta have a backup plan. So you can't just say, all right, no to these things. You have to start saying yes to some other things. So, wind and solar and things like that, or cleaner ways of creating jobs. But they're higher costs, and they don't have the benefits of the people who control the reserves.
Just a question, is CO2 released when you burn natural gas?
It is,
As much as
and a
coal.
larger concern is also methane that's released, even during the drilling process, the fracking process itself, which methane is not spoken of as much, but is actually a more potent greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide.
I guess the good news is that there's less carbon coming out when you burn the natural gas than would be if you. It's a win compared to coal, but it's still, a loss compared to, not burning.
And actually, some research says it's not a win based compared to coal.
Oh, is that right?
Anymore. You get 44% less carbon dioxide on a per energy basis if you use natural gas instead of coal. The problem is that is only what's called the burner tip calculation. It's at the source of ignition of the coal and the natural gas. Because fracking, in particular shale gas, is very energy intensive in constructing the wells and in removing the gas and getting it to a pipeline from many distributed areas. There are many what are called life cycle considerations that come in with natural gas. All of the trucks, all of the energy that goes into the fracking process, the energy that goes into supplying the water, purifying or disposing of the water afterwards. All of these essentially create greenhouse gases that wouldn't be created from conventional gas. Then there's the methane issue. Natural gas is mostly methane. It's an extremely powerful greenhouse gas over the 20 to 30 year time frame. And it's estimated based on what I just recently heard is that it's estimated that maybe from 4 to 8% of the methane extracted from fracked wells actually leaks or otherwise escapes during the process. That's a pretty large fraction, and I'm sure that technologies may develop to reduce that. But at the current time, when you add up all of those different emissions, fracking does not look a whole lot better and possibly even worse than just digging the coal out of the ground and from a CO2 perspective. I mean, there are other considerations as well, but just from her.
I mean, in terms of whether there should be a moratorium, some of the environmental problems are already alluded to, but there are many aside from global warming, climate change, chief among them probably groundwater pollution from things like methane that we have found to be in water in Pennsylvania, and the reports of that too. The fairly, goes without saying, toxic mix of chemicals that are part of that water cocktail that's mixed and shot into the ground to enable the fracking process, some of it even being at some point radioactive. So the potential for groundwater pollution, getting into our drinking water supplies, not to mention the fact that we're simply using a whole lot of fresh water, which is actually a pretty precious commodity, and using a lot of it to do fracking means we have a lot less to do other things, including drinking and watering our crops during droughts, and all those other fabulous things that water is good for. There are also some concerns about lower level air pollution, not just climate change, air pollution way up in the atmosphere, but even air pollution that could have some deleterious human health impacts. There are certainly reports of people living near fracking wells and experiencing headaches, nausea, and other forms of physical discomfort associated with being exposed to the chemicals that are being released during the fracking process. So, now I'm going back on some of my devil's advocate I was playing at the beginning and putting on my environmentalist hat.
Okay, I actually want to touch on something a little geological, more based on that. Because recently there have been articles and opponents against fracking have been saying like that that fracking has been causing like problems under the earth rather than just groundwater. Like some have said earthquakes, some have said like sinkholes or things like it. I want to know is there any proof or is there any truth to that matter? If it just affects the rock layers or anything like that that could be harmful for the ecosystem or humans.
Well, let's talk about earthquakes, because I think earthquakes are probably the thing that has caused the most attention. Frack water from Pennsylvania was being disposed of in Ohio. Apparently, Pennsylvania has very few injection wells. And by the way, the idea of disposal of water, the water that's pumped down to fracture the rocks comes back out again. It has to, so that they can extract the gas. That water not only has the chemicals in and some dissolved gas, it also has a lot of salts and other things that are dissolved from the rocks. The water that comes out has what's called dissolved solids in it. Essentially, it's minerals in solution. Those frac fluids can essentially be much more salty than seawater under some conditions. And it varies. But this is water which is not the kind of water you want anywhere. What's been discovered through sort of hard experience is that you cannot treat it by running it through a standard municipal water or wastewater treatment plant. And this was tried at first. Gas companies thought, oh, we'll just send our truck over to the treatment plant, and those plants are incapable of dealing with the high total dissolved solids in the water. So that means you either need to set up specialized treatment facilities or you need to get rid of it some other way. And the least expensive way to get rid of it is to pump it into wells that were drilled for another purpose, in which the rocks are porous enough and fractured enough to accept all the water that you can pump down there. When that happened in Ohio, at least one of the wells started to experience earthquakes in its vicinity, and the United States Geological Survey has stated that the fracking fluids were the most likely cause of those earthquakes. I'm not sure that this is a general problem. I'm not sure it would exist many places. To me, earthquakes are the least of our problems with fracking, so it's not something I think is a big deal from my perspective.
I have there's an article in the paper last week that there was some kind of convention for supporters of the drilling, and I think Governor Corbett was there. He is the governor, right? And so he spoke for it, and he said, we said something to the effect of that we've been doing this for a really long time, the whole drilling thing, and it's only now come to public attention. But after what you said, Dr. Lutz, it sounded like he might have been referring or alluding to the time when the gas is just coming up before they had to do the fracking. So now I'm wondering about some of the other stuff he said.
Yeah, I'm not sure what he was referring to.
And but he also said that it's making a lot of money for the state, and so I was wondering what your impressions are as to how far the technology has progressed. Like, is it very profitable? What they're, I guess it is what they're doing, because they're very interested in doing it. But also, like, what are the uses of natural gas? Like, when people have gas in their homes, is that natural gas? For some reason, I just like, what are the uses? How are they using it?
Yeah, well, two parts to your question. You'll remind me of the second part if I lose it. I'm talking about the first part. First of all, the natural gas is, it doesn't seem very expensive if you've got it in your home. I mean, we ordinarily get it from PECO or another energy supplier at maybe in 100 cubic foot units. The units to which price is attached at larger scale transactions is 1,000 cubic feet. And 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas costs a few dollars. It's as low as right now around $2 or $3 at the wellhead, and sometimes it goes up to about $10 per 1,000 cubic feet. In the Marcellus Shale, according to fairly conservative estimates, there are 141 billion thousand square feet, 1,000 cubic feet of natural gas. That's a lot of gas, and it's a lot of money. And as the price of natural gas fluctuates, there are huge amounts of money to be made if you're extracting the gas at the right time. So just from an economic perspective, the gas is very valuable. It's many, many billions, hundreds of billions of dollars of gas. And the second part of your question was?
I was just wondering how they ended up using it.
What is natural gas used for? Well, it's used now for a lot of things that involve pure heat applications. For example, your range. If you've got gas at home, you turn it on, you got a flame. So things that involve flames, gas is wonderful for that kind of use. The biggest thing that's being looked at as a way to use this vast amount of shale gas, if it ever comes online, is really to replace coal in electric power generation. That's already a process which has started to happen, but that would be the big.
There are also some minor usages in vehicles for compressed natural gas, but it's pretty, it had never really quite caught on.
Doesn't the university have a natural gas car? They still have one?
It does. It's wonderful that we do, but it's not catching on out there. So and even T. Boone Pickens couldn't get us to do more with that.
What is being released back into the wells that you said is causing the earthquakes?
The water that is used to fracture the rock comes back out of the wells.
And what does it leave in the earth?
Pardon me?
What does it leave in the rock? Is it just hollow when the water comes
In
out?
a way, it's hollow. It's filled with other fluids, particularly natural gas would be flowing through the fractures that are in the rock.
So what happens is the water goes in and comes out really quick?
Yeah, it can be pretty dramatic in some cases. I've seen pictures where the water is essentially jetted out because it's more or less like if you shake up a soda bottle, you have a liquid and it's got dissolved gas in it. So these fracked wells generally are thousands, well, it depends, but in some cases they're thousands of feet below the surface. under those pressures, essentially the water that you put down gets a lot of gas dissolved in it. And when you allow it to come back to the surface, that gas forms bubbles, and it comes frothing out the top of the well, just like if you shake a soda bottle or soda can and open it up. So there are ways to control that. It's not unusual, but yeah, it comes out pretty quick.
Is natural gas more viscous than water? Oh, okay, it's like the same.
It flows, it's a gas. I mean, it behaves under low pressures, it behaves like you know, any compressed gas, like the gas you put in a balloon or something like that.
Okay.
Okay, I'll switch it back to politics and economics for a bit. There was mention of Governor Corbett and more particular PA politics. One of the main issues he's getting a lot of flack on is taxing of these companies that are fracking here, and it's a kind of unique economic issue because unlike a lot of other things in economics, this resource is not going to go anywhere. It's under the ground, and I believe Pennsylvania is 80% made up of Marcellus shale, 80 to 90%.
Just in terms of the area?
The whole surface area.
I'm thinking maybe not quite that much. It's a large area though. It's significant.
So many people are asking in this budget crisis era, with a lot of things being outweighed, I mean, a lot of cuts, should it be taxed more? Should there be a tax hike? From my knowledge, it hasn't been like taxed harshly yet, but it should it be?
Well, I guess it depends on what your purpose is for engaging in the process in the first place. If the purpose is to generate a lot of gas and jobs, then I would say don't tax it. You're going to slow it down. So you're just defeating your own ends. If your purpose is to raise revenue and leverage this into some other things, so we'll slow this down and speed something else up. Well, then, to me, it's pretty obvious that you should tax it. It seems to me pretty clear that the current administration is hell bent on the first policy, not the second policy. You know, which is fine. They're elected, and it is a political thing, and like what the economic. The only economic thing that would make sense in terms of taxing would be if there was some sort of carbon tax or some sort of tax associated with the harm to the groundwater or something like that. But just a pure tax on the good because it raises revenue, I don't know if that is has any clear economic foundation. But at this point, if you're going to do a carbon tax, you don't want to just put it on natural gas. That would have to go on the coal and the oil and everything else. In terms of the drilling, I guess that's more specific there. But even at that point, it's hard to quantify the damage that it's doing to the groundwater and even come up with what would be an appropriate tax. So again, I think my answer is pretty clear. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree that, I mean, you have to look at taxes and what is your objective, right? Taxes essentially, at the end of the day, are about discouraging behavior, right? You're making something more expensive so people will do it less. Right? That's what a tax is. So if you want people to engage in fracking less, tax it. Right? That's a surefire way to do that. If that's from an environmental perspective, as you're getting at, this idea of that there are all these kind of external costs associated with drilling for natural gas, the things that we've mentioned, right? Environmental damage, human health costs. So we're going to come up with a tax that encapsulates the costs associated with those things so that when we buy our cubic foot of natural gas, the price of it reflects the costs associated with it in a more comprehensive way. We're not just paying for the gas and what it took to get it out of the ground, but we're paying for the environmental damage, we're paying for the human health effects. And those things are tricky to quantify. Certainly the EPA and other government agencies have no problem coming up with quantities that apparently tell us what our lives are worth, and that's how we make these cost-benefit decisions, but it's certainly not without controversy. But at the end of the day, we have to think, what is our objective here? Do we want to encourage this, or do we want to discourage it? And that's how you decide to tax it.
Are income taxes to discourage income? Or how does that work?
Oh, that's certainly actually quite a controversy
Mhm.
in policy and in economics, is that why do we discourage behavior we would theoretically wish to encourage?
Makes sense.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the fact of the matter is, if you're gonna raise revenue by taxing, you're gonna have to tax something. And there are very few things that you can tax that don't alter behavior.
Mhm.
So you can tax somebody just for being alive, right? So, a head tax or something like that, but then people get, you know, upset at those things because they're not, you know, progressive, or
Progressive.
they're regressive. Or you can tax people for dying, which is something they don't control, and, but then it, you know, people say, well, you know, then it interferes with the transfer of wealth to your children. So the efficient tax is a tax that wouldn't change behavior. And those taxes tend to be pretty blatantly unfair. So you're on a fairness, efficiency, there's an edge there, trade-off, yeah. So everything, in economics, we try to recognize the fact that everything is a trade-off. You know, if you wanna make an omelet, you have to break some eggs. And this is one of those situations where, you know, this is what you want, and this is a policy issue. If this is what people want, then these are the consequences. You just have to be clear about that. And if people decide they don't want it, then there's tools you can use to discourage it. And the market tool is just is a tool to get something done, and it works pretty well. If you want something to happen, you would unleash the market forces, and it will happen. So for example, if you wanted to clean up the environment and just, you know, put less carbon in the atmosphere, well, the surest way to do that is to tax carbon. And the market will ratchet that back, and it will get that done. But, you know, so it's a tool, but it has no mind, it doesn't have any values, it just does what it does.
And maybe you can clarify something for me, Tom, or Ashley. A couple of years ago in this debate, when Governor Corbett was first elected, there was a lot of talk about whether the gas industry in Pennsylvania should be subject to something that was called the severance tax. Severance tax, as I understand it, relates to a tax that simply relates to the removal of a resource from the ground. In other words, it's a production tax. Is that correct? And is there any basis for setting the rate of a severance tax?
You know what, did you say they would be subject to it? Because this is the first time I've
This
ever
is-
heard of that. I mean, so.
Well, many states do
Like
have
extraction
severance
taxes and things like that,
Yeah,
right?
but
So-
Pennsylvania rejected that idea, I believe, so we don't have one, but, if we were gonna have one, how would we determine, what would be some ways in which you could possibly determine a rate for such a tax?
Well, you know what? I mean, the thing about the tax is that it discourages. You know, and so right now we tax labor, which discourages people from working. And then, we don't tax natural resources, so what we've done is sort of bias the system, you know, away from labor and towards use of natural resources. And then on top of that, we don't tax consumption, so that encourages people to consume more. So the whole thing is you know, it's biased sort of towards an extractive economy. So you can tamp that down just by changing the way you tax things. You could lower taxes on labor and increase taxes on natural resources or things like that. You can decrease the income tax and increase the consumption tax, and then you could have revenue neutrality, or, you know, in theory, some way. But what the appropriate rate would be, I have no idea.
Well, I think what was interesting to me is that in the discussion about whether Pennsylvania should have such a tax, it turned out that most, if not all, of the other states that are big players in hydrocarbon extraction, whether that's petroleum or natural gas, already had severance taxes. And Pennsylvania, if they didn't approve one, was sort of gonna be like the weird kid on the block for not having one. So I'm assuming that if states like Texas, that depend a lot on the petroleum economy, would put a tax on the products that were coming out of their ground, there had to be something that came out of that.
I have heard almost no talk of that, so even if there is a tax, I suspect that it's not a significant number. I mean, you can put a tax on something, if it's not enough to, get anybody's back up, then, it probably could be raised. But I haven't heard of that debate too much.
I think another important thing though to think about in light of this to social taxes goes back to one of the earlier comments Dr. Lutz made, and that relates to subsidies, right? So when we want to discourage things, we tax them. When we want to encourage them, we subsidize them. And so perhaps at the starting point is to stop subsidizing if we don't even make it to the leap of taxing, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's one important, I think, piece of it.
We subsidize first so we can tax later.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the whole thing is just that this is the way, economics is all about arranging things. The root of economics, the eco part, means the home, like ecology, and then the nomos part at the end means to manage or to arrange. And I guess Adam Smith's great insight was that, independent economic agents, people, arrange their activities based on their own self-interest, and that will arrange the economy in a good way. And that was a great idea 200 or 300 years ago. It was like a miracle insight. So I like to think of it as like, if you had a stack of spaghetti and you had it stacked up just like that, you think, wow, that's the way that should be arranged. So if Adam Smith had like spaghetti laying around and then he blasted off to outer space and then came back 200 years later, he would say, if people were just left alone, they'd see that nice neat stack when he get back. But then when he gets back, it's like the spaghetti's all over the room. And what the hell happened? Well, it's because the prices aren't right. So nobody has the right incentives to do things that will arrange that thing in a way that's sort of optimal, or even close to optimal. So now none of the prices are right. So what we need to do is create a whole system of taxes and subsidies. So subsidize the things we want more of, tax the things that we want less of, and get the exact right tax ratio, subsidy ratio on all these millions of products. There's a word for that. That's what's called a command economy. So, at that point, you're controlling every price. And I know our computers are a lot more powerful than they used to be, but I still don't know that we can do that. So I think what we have to do is we have to look at where things are really messed up and tinker with it and see if we can just make a marginal improvement to make things better. And to me, the most glaring point is this carbon problem, where every other industry, to a certain extent, if they pollute, they get taxed, or there's regulation or something. But the carbon, because it's, I suppose, because it's colorless and odorless, and you breathe it in and out every day, that's the one we can't get our minds wrapped around. That's going to like steamroll us, and then that's where the politics become really interesting, especially in this country, because you have an entire party that's just just doesn't want to come to grips with like any negative impact associated with the carbon, and I mean, you can actually lose a lot of votes for saying carbon is a problem, and so I don't know how we get past that to start tinkering with the economy in an appropriate way. I mean, it really becomes a political issue at this point, not an economic issue. The economics is pretty clear. Science is pretty clear. Politics are not clear. At least that's the way I think about it.
Yeah, I mean, I think that was my initial hesitation with the first question, should there be a moratorium? From a political perspective, that's not so simple a question as it is from an environmental perspective. The main motive for politicians is to get reelected. You get reelected by making people happy, right? And what makes people happy is times of prosperity. Right? And that's the message you're selling, and you're saying that disrupting this new innovative thing we've developed, fracking, right, it's not so appealing. So I think a large part of whether we can tax, whether there can be a moratorium, regardless of whether there should be, comes down to people effectively packaging whatever policy they want. All of it, a lot comes down to labeling and rhetoric. You have to tell a good story, convince people, and get them on your side. You know, you mentioned the recent events, the conference down in Philly, and I ran into at the farmers market this weekend, Richard Whiteford, who's a fairly prominent environmental activist in the community. He had attended this event, and I asked him, so, you know, how did it go? And this fairly prominent, fairly radical, one might even say, activist said, you know, I was really quite disappointed. I was disappointed because the people who were there representing the anti-fracking side kind of made fools of themselves, and they made the rest of us look like fools, because instead of, right, telling a convincing story where you're not maybe portraying yourself as that unlikable, radical, granola-eating, tree-hugging environmentalist, right, the hat I proudly wear oftentimes, right, you have to say something that appeals to the everyday man, right? It's not that this is hurting the environment. You have to tell a story. You have to act civilized, right? You have to tell a story that makes it clear this is impacting you, everyday person. You don't need to be this environmentalist who has the luxury of worrying about things that might happen down the road. This is going to impact your drinking water. This is going to impact your family. And I think that's where the crux of the issue lies, is telling that story that reaches people. That's what you have to do.
Okay. One of the suggestions or method, reasons that we should be hydraulic fracturing here in Pennsylvania, and any place that we have natural gas, is that it would provide a bridge between now when we're burning fossil fuels to let the technology develop for more affordable green energy. Now, that argument has been presented by, anybody from oil companies to, I guess to put this light, moderate environmentalists. Is it a bridge? And should it, I know in Pennsylvania, we have, 50 years worth of Marcellus shale natural gas. Is it a good idea to use natural gas from fracking to build a bridge from fossil fuels to green energy?
I think, I think you could use it as a bridge. I don't see any evidence that we are using it as a bridge. It's that kind of bridge, you have to force it, because the people who are getting the revenue from the shale, they have no particular incentive to use that wealth to build solar panels or windmills or whatever. So if you want that bridge, then tax it, use the revenue to get the other thing done. That certainly is. It could become a bridge. I don't think it's just gonna miracle bridge pops up because you're fracking.
I think in the history of energy use in the United States, just thinking about the natural gas, we've gone from these gas deposits, conventional, that are associated with petroleum. We found some gas, conventional, that was not associated with petroleum. We found coal bed methane as a source of gas. And there's been sort of this progression of sort of using the easiest, least expensive ones first. You can look at each one of them as being sort of a bridge to the next thing, but I think Tom, from my perspective, hit the nail on the head. If we want to have a bridge technology or bridge fuel or bridge energy, we need to have a bridge policy that's going to make it a bridge. Otherwise, it's just going to be another blind step down the road of digging ourselves into more and more expensive energy resources that are going to run out, which means that we need another bridge to somewhere. And we're not thinking about where that bridge is going at this point, if it is going to be a bridge. So I think the real thinking has to go on at the level of what do we want? What do we want to bridge to? And how are we, practically speaking, gonna get there from here?
I also think that there's a fundamental problem with having politicians with political motives and ties to interest groups and the like, choosing technologies that are gonna be kind of our winning technologies, and that certainly isn't just in fracking, right? We're picking that to be our bridging technology. There's a long history of doing that with biofuels, right? Something I actually have quite a bit of familiarity with. We've decided that's gonna be a great thing, right? Because we can grow it here, get off foreign oil, right? And at least initially, right, before we started studying it a whole lot more, there was the promise of a lot of environmental benefits. But the fact is, a key reason why we went towards ethanol, key reason why we're going towards fracking, is because there are powerful interests that benefit from us using biofuels and engaging in fracking. So I think the important thing and the more economically, environmentally, pretty much in any way responsible thing would be to not try and pick winners, not subsidize the individual alternative energies because we as politicians have decided those are the ones that are the best, but to rather do something like have a cap and trade system or have a carbon tax that simply discourages the behavior you want to discourage, and then whatever technology truly is the best, right, will rise up to the top, the one that is gonna give us the least carbon, the most bang for our buck, right? That's, to me, what needs to happen.
Then again, I guess a question that would go along with that then is that if you look at the development of fracking, if you look at the petroleum industry today, if you look at agriculture today, all of these, commonplace things that are going on in our economy have had and do have enormous subsidies associated with
Absolutely.
them. So, it's not like these things just trundle off on their own at some point. We have to keep giving subsidies, and I mean, a question that I have is, are subsidies of that nature really something that we should be doing? And what are we subsidizing? You say subsidies are for encouraging certain things to happen. What are we encouraging by devoting large amounts of government money to programs that, by and large, I'm not sure the